Good morning, my friends, and welcome to the Trinity Forum. My name is BJ Owens. I'm the Dean of Trinity Cathedral in downtown Cleveland, Ohio. And today is Earth Day, or rather, today is the Sunday on which we celebrate and observe Earth Day. I know technically Earth Day was this past Thursday. But this morning, I am really thrilled to have Jeff Opperman here with us. Jeff is the lead global freshwater scientist for the World Wildlife Fund. He works across the WWF network, and with external partners to direct research that can strengthen conservation strategies and integrate science into freshwater programs and projects. He lives here in the greater Cleveland area. He wrote recently for Cleveland.com and the Plain Dealer an article about the pandemic and about how our care and management of the natural environment can help us to head off future pandemics, or when we fail to really manage it properly, make us more vulnerable to them as well. But he also recently wrote an op-ed for the New York Times about how our culture is losing its language, its references, its connections to references to nature in our language and in our art and our pop music. And he did that through the lens of Taylor Swift songs. So we're going to talk a little about that too. So I want to welcome you, Jeff. Jeff, thank you for joining me here on the Trinity Forum.
Great, thank you very much. It's great to be here.
We were talking just a little bit before we began recording. Of course, everything is with the backdrop of the pandemic, and here we are. We're talking about Earth Day, and this gives us a great opportunity to talk a little bit about where our care for the environment, for the created world, connects with social justice, which connects with how we've experienced this past year together. Um, so much of what we go through and we see, we're seeing it through the lens of what we've experienced in the past year. And so I want to start off with that and to ask, what do you think we'll be doing differently from an environmental standpoint, or what do you hope we're going to be doing differently as we move into whatever a normal life looks like? What have we learned in the past 12, 16, 18 months that you'd really like to see us hold on to as a lesson?
Well, interesting question. And I think that's one of the great challenges of the pandemic is that there have been a number of resets in how we look at things, how we interact, how we behave. And some of those adaptations that we've been through are worth pursuing and worth holding on to. And so it may seem a bit counterintuitive that things that we did in response to a global pandemic are worth holding on to, but some of them are, because I think this really did force us into a period of reflection and response and resiliency. And just one kind of silly example is all over the world, we've learned how our presence affects wildlife. Just us being there affects wildlife in parks and visiting, and that when people were truly absent, wildlife biologists were studying it and realizing that, wow, they'd never even realized that the animal's behavior was being changed. It was just part of the baseline because people were always there, or boats were always there, or something affecting dolphin behavior. And so, but we're not going to retain that. We're not going to suddenly just stop being out in nature. In fact, I'm sure through the rest of the talk, we'll be talking about the importance of having connections to nature. So we're not going to stop, but can we extract from that important lessons about, well, what if we adjusted our behavior just a little bit? What if we avoided just this little area and let the animals have this, this freedom from our interference? So can we really reinvigorate how we connect with nature in a way that's sensitive to some of the things we learned this time around about how inadvertently we're affecting wildlife and all that. And then the other thing I think is just this great opportunity to build back better. I think that's a slogan that a lot of people have used. And the realization that we are capable of big things. I don't think society just anticipated a challenge of this scale. We haven't faced a challenge of this scale societally since World War II. And I think we'd maybe come to think that we're not capable of rising to that level. Well, it hasn't been easy. We've had divisions, but we are rising to the challenge. We are hopefully coming out of this. We're mobilizing science, mobilizing funding, interventions at a scale that is almost unprecedented. And all of a sudden, doing that for, say, the climate crisis shouldn't seem so incredibly daunting. I think a year and a half ago, people thought, well, we'll never be able to rise to the challenge of the climate crisis. We can't mobilize that kind of funding or that kind of behavioral change. Well, we just were forced into doing something of that scale, and in fact, a grander scale in some ways in a shorter amount of time. So can we take those lessons of our ability to follow through on big things, and can we carry that forward?
Do you see some practical places where that's beginning to happen? Obviously, the creation of a vaccine and the implementation of that is one massive mobilization. But can you begin to see the threads of places where, from an environmental standpoint, that may take some shape?
Well, I do think that this realization that we are capable of doing big things, when you combine that with the incredible technical engineering progress around renewable energy, what's called the renewable revolution, with dramatic drop in cost of wind and solar and other technologies, dramatic improvements with how we manage electrical grids. It's showing us that we can actually we can do this, and we can do it without great cost. You know, earlier I just mentioned the realization that we can do these things that might require massive costs. Well, I think we're getting to understand more and more that progress on the climate isn't really about cost, it's about opportunity. And I believe the Secretary of State just made that point. He said, we've got to transfer from this idea that the climate crisis, well, it's a crisis, or climate requires us to do all these sacrifices. Well, no, it's the world is changing so quickly with the renewable revolution. The technologies are moving so fast that the future opportunities are there, and it's really incumbent on our country to seize those opportunities.
Yeah, this is such a moment for opportunities. What you're a scientist. I'm a Christian minister, so bear with me if I occasionally go into flights of fancy as we talk about that, and we can talk about if it's backed up by data or not. But the I often talk about, or in my own reflections of the last year have been one to address and recognize the profound grief of what we've lost, and household by household that looks different, and in some places it is profound, and in others cases it's less so. But here we're in the midst of it, and for some people they're not ready for optimism or opportunity for good reason. At the same time, I think it's important for us in all areas of our lives to take this time and say, okay, how do we want to spend the rest of our lives? As I would say, how is what is God wanting us to see at any moment of our lives? And somehow the places where there's a reset here, we're perhaps able to see things that we weren't before. I know that for me, this has been such a stressful year to be able to on a Friday or Saturday go to one of the metro parks and hike for a few hours. That has just I'm going to use a phrase from today's scripture, which is it revives my soul. It really does. And what an opportunity there we're in now to see. Yeah, we need to do some things differently, but to recognize that nature isn't just there for our revival. We're in a relationship with the world, and your article in the Plain Dealer really made that lifted that up for me to recognize that how we care for the environment has a really big influence on what kind of pandemics we might be seeing in the future. Can you say just a little bit more about that?
Sure. The uh, so COVID-19 is what's called a zoonotic uh, infectious disease, and zoonotic means it's a disease that started in animals, and then what's called spillover. It spills over into humans, and then if humans can transmit it to each other, it can become a pandemic. And almost all of the pandemics that we're familiar with, these horrible events of disease that have swept over the world, have been zoonotic in origin. The 1918 flu, that was an avian flu, an avian type of flu. Ebola, SARS, AIDS, Zika. They're all these are all zoonotic in origin. And in fact, there's been 3 to 4 new zoonotic diseases emerging every year. And scientists estimate that there's potentially nearly 1 million viruses out there in the world, in animal populations, that could spill over to humans. So if you think about that, there's always been barriers essentially between most wildlife and in people. And even though so much of what I want to talk about is about connectivity with nature, this is one time that I will emphasize the idea of barriers. That when there are barriers, healthy barriers between people and nature, that will keep us safe from zoonotic disease. And I don't mean that you can't go out on the metro parks and hike. That's the kind of connectivity we need. We need to be immersing ourselves in nature. When I mean barriers where we're not intruding in kind of sudden or abrupt ways in nature, such as widespread deforestation, such as wildlife trapping, hunting, the trade of wildlife for meat or for pets, the markets where we combine domestic wildlife, domestic animals, wildlife, people, all in very crammed spaces where diseases can quickly mutate and concentrate and spread. When we take agriculture and intensify it in new places, bringing livestock and wild animals and people into new mixes that have never happened before. Those are the barriers that, if we can restore those, we can reduce the risk of future pandemics. And we restore them by having healthy forests with healthy populations of wildlife that we're not incurring upon in these kind of violent ways, for lack of a better word. And the good thing about those, so many of these solutions that will reduce our risk of pandemics are the same solutions we need to make progress on climate change or to reverse the dramatic decline of wildlife. So how we interact, our relationship with the earth and ecosystems and wildlife is at the heart of our future risk of pandemics.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you talk about barriers, I hear that what I hear in that is that nature envisions some level of barriers, that we having a certain level of forestation in your nearby, um, rather than turning everything into red clay and building on top of everything, means there's a certain balance that we're never going to fully understand. We're grateful for all the gifts of discernment and study that help us to learn from that, but there's mystery and complexity to nature, and there are keeping that relationship in balance sometimes does involve a barrier, even if it's one at the level of we can't just plow over everything and expect everything to go just fine.
Yes, yeah, very right. And I'm still struggling with that word barrier, as I said it. But it is this,
Right.
let's say, a healthy compartmentalization between
Right.
forest and where we live, and or forests and agriculture, kind of just a healthy mix, a healthy balance, and barriers in the sense that, yeah, healthy forests are where they are, and productive
Right.
agricultural land is where it is, and we live in, and we're not suddenly mixing and pushing into those areas
Right.
and mixing things up in ways that can increase our risk.
Mm-hmm. Well, I also hear the value of limits. Any healthy religion is going to impose some limits on what we as people can do, and not so that we're not just satisfying our own wants and needs in every moment. And we see in that some of the balance that God envisions for our lives, and that I think very much involves a healthy appreciation of and reverence for the environment, for the created world. Well, a couple of things that I really valued about some of your articles and some of your work. There's this thread of integration all the way through it. How we live our lives, how we live in our families, how we promote development that is sustainable, but also economically sustainable and caring for everybody involved. I appreciated your attention to the fact that even though you just use that word compartmentalization, and I appreciate that, in the really at the end there's a deep connection to all of these areas of our lives that very much connect to the environment as well. But the other is complexity. You really name that, and you name it really beautifully, because I don't hear in your work, you write a lot about recognizing, for example, talking about the Mekong River, about any river, and about how there really are limits to how much you can dam a river, and not without impacting the supply of fish that are available for the people who depend on that source. But at the same time, I don't hear you writing, let's all go off the grid and not worry about developing, because that in itself is not really justice to everybody involved. Can you say just a little bit more about what that complexity means? Both from, we haven't really talked about your trip 10 years ago with your family, but it's in some of your writings, as you journey down the Mekong River in Vietnam, and how so much of your work is around that and around freshwater sources around the world. Can you say a little bit about what that complexity teaches you, and what we perhaps all can learn from it, as we think about this question of how do we balance the need to have pristine natural resources with the need to develop so that everybody has a chance to live with some degree of prosperity?
Great. Yeah, great questions, and set of observations as well. And when just reflecting a bit on you're mentioning limits, and that religions have limits. And it really does seem like the notion that there are limits on what we will do and what we will take for ourselves is part of our contract with each other and part of our contract with future generations, about how do we achieve a balance, a balance between what I'm willing to take and what that will leave for you. And our country is struggling with these ideas of balance and equity and
Yes, we are.
income distribution and all of that. And it's a
Right.
fundamental challenge. But the idea of balance and complexity. So yeah, I mean, river systems are quite complicated, and they're complicated in ways that can be hard, that defy a simple understanding. We usually just think of a river as a blue line on a map. A river is where it is, and the land is where it is, and and they don't mix. Here's the land and here's the river. Well, rivers like the Mekong defy that easy characterization that a river is a blue line on a map, because the Mekong during the monsoon rains will swell to dramatically larger areas than its low flow time, and it's connected to lakes like a lake called the Tonle Sap Lake in Cambodia. But the lake will swell by 10 times in terms of its surface area. It's a massive spreading out of this lake, and it goes from
Hmm.
a few feet deep to about 20 feet deep. And if you go there in the dry season, you'll be amazed, because there are villages that are on stilts and they are 25 feet in the air. And in the dry season, it looks, it's hard to imagine, because they are so high up with just scaffolding below them. But if you come back in the height of the flood season, the water is lapping at their highest step where they're canoeing. So it's remarkable. But that complexity, that change over time, is what drives the incredible productivity of the Mekong River. It is almost 20% of all freshwater fish harvested in the world are coming from that river, the Mekong, driven by this,
Did you say 25%?
about 20%. Yeah.
Oh my heavens.
Yeah, it's amazing. Um, and there are tens of millions of people who their primary source of protein and a variety of nutrients is this wild capture fishery, coming, just putting in a net and bringing out fish from this river system. And it's so phenomenally productive because it has that complexity of habitat, complexity of hydrology. And the Mekong swells so high that there's a river that flows into the Mekong, and basically the Mekong is this wall of water that it hits and it reverses, and the river flows in the opposite direction. And it actually, that's the river that fills up the Tonle Sap Lake that I just mentioned. So what happens is
Okay.
the lake normally,
So it gets it kind of gets refilled every year?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So in the dry season, the
Okay.
lake is slowly draining to the Mekong. Then the Mekong rises and it reverses and it fills up the lake. And Phnom Penh is the capital of Cambodia, is on that river called the Tonle Sap River, which connects the Mekong to the lake. And every year there's a period of time where the river just goes absolutely still for a couple days, and then it reverses flow. And there's a huge festival at that time, and it's because for thousands of years that's when the lake is going to begin to drain towards the river, and this incredible bounty of fish is going to be draining towards the Mekong out of this lake when the flow reverses. It's the flow reversal that happens annually. So it's just, that was a little more. I got a little inspired by a question about complexity, and I waded into some serious complexity there. But your other part.
No, that was fantastic. I hope nobody watches this because I want to use that as a sermon illustration. That was so beautiful about the stillness at but before I go down that road, this is a system that nobody would sit down and design. It is nature at its most beautiful and complex.
Mhm.
In almost entirely counterintuitive, I suspect, until you really sat down and looked at the science behind it. That surprises. I mean, it surprises me to sit here and listen to it, and it sounds almost otherworldly, and yet here we have nature providing for all the people in the midst of it through this curious movement. That one of the perhaps one of the greatest faults that we as humans have is that the feeling that we can figure it all out, and that we can let's build it the way we want, and if that doesn't work, we'll just keep fixing it. Let's just keep fixing it. Let's just keep fixing it until we've really broken it, rather than now coming back to that wonderful stillness at a moment where you just kind of sit and appreciate the wonder of, oh my gosh, look at all this fish that's coming, and to be able to have that kind of, I don't know, awe and humility and delight in nature all at once. That's a people who are very much in relationship with the river that they live by.
Yeah, it is an amazing system, and you're right. I don't think anyone would, a hydraulic engineer wouldn't design it that way from the beginning. Uh,
Right.
Not super efficient for drainage, the way it, goes into a couple directions and fills up, and certainly it's hard for us to relate to the idea of a lake growing 10 times in size. But that's the great civilization of Angkor Wat developed around that lake, and developed because of the bounty of those fish. So people have been adapting to that incredible complexity, and profiting from it, benefiting from it.
Say a little bit more about. I remember you telling a story, and that may have been in your in the sorry, presentation on YouTube, the about the village elder who talked about, um, even he was not suggesting that development and dams should stop.
Yeah, so that was one of those moments where you go into a place with your preconceived notions and your simple narratives. And I would work for a conservation organization, and these dams on the Mekong that are proposed were going to stop all that connectivity and complexity, and that the big annual flow pulse that swells the river and drives, and also the fish in the Mekong migrate long distance, and so dams would block it, just like the dams blocked the salmon in the Pacific Northwest.
Mhm.
So when I was visiting a village, as we were floating on the river in Laos, and the village headman was talking, and I was waiting for that narrative I was waiting for him to fulfill my narrative, to, like, he had a role to play. He was supposed to talk about things that would meet my expectations, that he didn't want these dams, that these dams were going to cause too many impacts because his village depends on fish. But he kind of sat there, and he said, referenced the utter darkness around us. And
Mm,
that was another realization. Like, I loved how dark it was. You could see the stars in an incredible way, and my children loved it.
right.
But to me, that was an amazing experience. To other people, that was just a reminder that, the generator only worked for a few hours a night, and then the generator went off and they were back to darkness. And it's a completely different viewpoint on darkness. And he kind of gestured to that darkness, and he was saying, we need dams, we need roads, bridges, hospitals. He said, we need everything. So I was like, that wasn't my narrative. Let me kind of adjust my narrative and incorporate this and figure this out. And 10 years ago, I remember being so torn, thinking, well, they truly need electricity in this part of the world, particularly in Laos, also in Cambodia. The electrification rates, people just needed electricity and development and revenue that would go into the coffers of the government so they could build roads and bridges and hospitals. And it just seemed like this terrible trade-off that they needed it. The dams were the best way to get it. And what could we do? We could try to make it better. We could try to offer some solutions, but I felt like we were kind of nibbling at the margins. Well, in the 10 years in between, that's when this renewable revolution has just absolutely changed the whole landscape of energy and changed this necessity of terrible trade-offs. There is no reason now, and I can now feel very, it's much easier for me to stand there and talk about how these dams will affect the river, because I can talk about alternatives that are cost competitive, maybe even cheaper, with building a power system, building a grid that relies much more on wind, solar, batteries, grid integration, and not on these big dams on the Mekong that will shut down that organic machine that so many people depend upon. So the trade-off, the need to accept the trade-off, has mostly gone away because of this renewable revolution. So that's the great optimistic story. It's, I mean, not out of the woods yet, but that is a reason for optimism.
But so much farther down the road in 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, if I'd been more prescient, I probably could have seen all the indicators there, but I didn't see them. But they were coming even 10 years ago, and now the flowers are blooming.
Do you find that that technological revolution is getting into all the corners that it needs to? Is the Mekong, that seems to me to be one of the largest river systems in the world. I wonder if that kind of attention is making its way all around the world.
Well, there have been some really promising examples of these dams that would have had dramatic impacts. For example, on the Mekong, that Cambodia suspended two dams that would have been right on the whole river, very low down, would have blocked most fish migration, and they suspended them. And solar power has been taking off dramatically in Cambodia, with some of the cheapest prices of electricity in Southeast Asia coming from new solar projects. And so, yeah, this message that we are in a whole, a whole new world of electricity systems and potential and alternatives is, we're doing everything we can to spread this word, and try to stimulate the kinds of investments that will lead to this becoming a reality.
Okay. Well, let's come a little closer to home. Tell me a little bit about what you think, what you see as some of the most pressing or important environmental concerns here in Northeast Ohio and Cleveland in particular.
So what I would say is that, Cleveland and the Cuyahoga River and Lake Erie are some of the greatest success stories in the environment. And, one, it would be great for us just to really reflect on that and for more people to know that. And I think most people do. But we really have to maintain the progress that has been made and double down. And so we have a dramatically cleaner Cuyahoga River. We have a dramatically healthier lake than what we had 50 years ago. But the conditions are changing. Climate change is bringing a more rapid spring runoff, heavier storms in the spring, and it's taking fertilizer off the fields and soil off the fields and into Lake Erie. We're having warmer summers that part of what stimulates harmful algal blooms in the western basin of Lake Erie. And so, these are new challenges and new sources. Back in the 60s, we really controlled pipe sources of pollution and home and industrial uses of phosphorus. But now it's coming from agriculture, and it's much harder to manage. And so Lake Erie is this great success story. But the failure of Lake Erie and the failure of the Cuyahoga for decades, Cleveland was painted with those failures.
Right.
And I think that we were just beginning to flip that narrative to one of success rather than failure. And then in 2014, there was this massive algal bloom in western Lake Erie that shut down the drinking water for Toledo. It became national news, and amazing aerial photography of a green Lake Erie. And I was at a conference, and somebody put that up on the screen, and it was a boat going through a green lake, and its wake was splitting this pea soup, and then, here's Lake Erie, and I'm like, oh, all that progress and one photo from 2014. It's almost like we're back to the starting point, that all of a sudden Lake Erie in Cleveland, not Cleveland per se, but this was Toledo,
Right.
Lake Erie is being used again as an example of the failures. So we can't let that happen. It's an amazing resource. The Great Lakes collectively are 20% of the world's water. Water is going to become increasingly a coveted and scarce resource around the world due to climate change. We're sitting on the shores of 20% of the world's freshwater, and an amazing resource. Lake Erie produces more fish than the rest of the Great Lakes combined. It's an amazing asset, and so we really have to double down on protecting it and ensuring that it's viewed as an amenity that is a valuable resource for Cleveland, and not not what it was viewed recently. The other thing that we have to do is we have to keep working on the inclusion and equity of environmental progress. And this is something, you can't talk about the Cuyahoga and Lake Erie without talking about Carl Stokes, the mayor, first African-American mayor of a major US city in Cleveland in the late 60s. And he had this vision that environmental progress was inextricably linked with the progress of low-income neighborhoods, of neighborhoods that have been left behind, and that if we don't, the reason to clean things up is because it benefits them, because they're the ones who bear the brunt of it. Access to nature, access to parks. We need to, continue to get better at providing. We've been talking about connectivity to nature and the refuge that nature offers us, but that has to be available to everyone. And so that's another challenge as we go forward.
Well, since you bring up Carl Stokes, we in our conversation earlier, I asked you, and I'll ask you again because I'm still a relative newcomer to the Cleveland area. I got here actually 2 weeks or several months before the 50th anniversary of the Cuyahoga, and so it's interesting because suddenly that story becomes your story when you move to a place. So part of becoming a Clevelander, a member of, a part of this area, learning the Cuyahoga, learning the natural world. I'm also looking to what books, what texts, what movies, what podcasts, what nature trails do I need to know to really understand this area? And so, from your perspective as a scientist and environmentalist, what would you have me read?
Right. Well, as you mentioned that we had talked before, I don't feel so.
Okay, good. You can be honest. You can.
So this is Where the River Burned. It's by two brothers, David and Richard Stradling. One is a historian, one is a journalist. So it's kind of telling it has that mix. It has the rigor of something written by a historian, but it has the kind of pacing and feel of something written by a journalist. So it's a great combination. But really, what it does. And that Where the River Burned. I mean, it's really, as you said, this is I think of myself as when I introduce people, it's kind of like I come from where the river burned. Like that's what people think when they still 50 years later when they think of Cleveland. Like, oh, inevitably, I say where I'm from, pause, brace myself for joke. Insert joke here, and then then I'll offer you should see it. It's so nice and it's come so far. But that's the thing. So, but this story, and it's just such a great story of Carl Stokes, and I did not. All I knew was that he was the first African-American mayor of a major U.S. city, and that was a notable historical event, something Cleveland should be proud of.
Mm-hmm.
And then his administration overlapped with the burning of the river. I didn't necessarily put those two things together, and this really goes into depth about how Cleveland had gotten to the point that it had gotten, and how social justice and environmental equality were intertwined, and how Carl Stokes was really a visionary. I mean, he in the excerpts of his speeches and what he was saying, he was quite visionary about this. He was recognizing, one, that social justice and environmental equality are intertwined, and that I don't think the term environmental justice was around in 1968, 1969. It's a term we now understand. It's that the environmental movement needs to be thinking about neighborhoods that it often glossed over, and low-income neighborhoods, and the idea of environmental justice. But he put that front and center. He's like, this is why we need to clean up. We need to clean up because too long these neighborhoods have borne the brunt.
Right.
The second thing he said is Lake Erie and the natural environment is an amazing asset for Cleveland. It needs to be an amenity. It needs to be a draw. And he recognized that Cleveland was heading towards a post-industrial future. And most people in the late 60s were probably trying to figure out how to reinvigorate industry. Industry is still important to Cleveland. I'm not saying it's not, but recognizing that our employment base was going to be diversified. We couldn't go back to the majority of people working in factories. It's just the markets weren't going to allow that. We needed post-industrial. And so Lake Erie and other assets needed to be a draw for people to come to cities. To me, that sounds like what people began talking about in the 90s.
Right, exactly. At least 30 years ahead of his time.
So I read that and I thought, wow, this guy was really onto these themes. He cut through the simplicity of just saying pollution's bad, and he got to the heart of it, that there's an equity issue and that there's an amenity issue of value to cities, and that we have to do it for those reasons. So that I thought that was just really eye-opening to read.
In my reading and my exploration, and some of this goes back to before I moved up here, because I've had family in the area, and we always go to the History Museum, and always love to learn as a North Carolinian just how much the history of Cleveland has been one of innovation, and that our history is a lot deeper than 50 years. Uh, it's curious that when you go back to Carl Stokes and you look at what began with him in that era, that that is not what we hold on to and understand about Cleveland. Rather, we remember burning rivers and algae blooms, which says that we need to work a little harder to unearth and share the giftedness of this place, and especially of people like Carl Stokes, uh, because we see that this is a standard that got set for cities around the country, and it's been a great gift to learn through some of these conversations. What is at the heart of that?
Yeah.
So I'm going to segue from Carl Stokes to Taylor Swift, because who doesn't?
But
Because who doesn't?
that may be the first Carl Stokes to Taylor Swift.
That may be the first Carl Stokes to Taylor Swift. If so, I might be 30 years ahead of my time, and I hope so. I loved your article, your op-ed for the New York Times, and I'm not going to lie, it actually made me tear up a little bit as it finished. You're such a good writer, and made me think of my own family as I read it. Um, what does it mean that we? Well, first of all, why? What caught why Taylor Swift? Why as a scientist? And you performed data investigation into Taylor Swift songs to see if you could identify more nature references than in every other song, and the data says,
Yeah. Well, yeah.
yeah.
She has 7 times as much nature references as other pop songs, which is it's not twice as much, which
It's 7 times. That's a
7
lot.
times. Yeah. Uh, so for a while, I've been, really reflecting on the loss of connectivity between our culture and nature, and this idea of and this was all, when I took that trip with my family and I wrote about it on the Mekong, the dominant. So there were 2 themes, and they were about balance. They were finding balance between hydropower and fish on the Mekong, and finding balance between kids that you knew were going to be technologically connected, but finding that balance where they still retained connection to nature. So that holding on to what's important, even as we move forward, has always been something that I struggle with and I want to write about and I want to learn about. Um, and but that's not how I came across Taylor Swift. I came across just because, on Twitter, a lot of people that I respect, that I follow, I mean, I respect in terms of their opinion on music, just kept saying, "Wow, this Folklore album by Taylor Swift is really good." And I've known about Taylor Swift, but I just, it's kind of just a different generation. I have my music, and I didn't really have a positive or negative opinion of her, just that she was this giant, pop singer. And but more and more people were saying this album's amazing. So like, okay, I should not be so close-minded that I won't go explore this pop album or Folklore. So I started listening to it, and I'm listening to it on Spotify. And on Spotify, when when it's playing, you've got your little on your phone. There's every song has like a 7-second video that just plays on loop,
Right.
so in the background. And every time I look down, on my phone, there was a little image of Taylor Swift in nature. She was in a meadow. She was by a pond. She was walking through the woods. There was uh, waves on the shore. I mean, just I thought, this is interesting. And I kind of started
Mhm.
looking. Every single one was a nature theme. And then I looked at the cover of the album, and it's Taylor Swift in a really beautiful forest, foggy forest. And the nature words themselves are subtle. I had not picked up on the nature words, but then I just began to listen. I'm like, oh, her characters in these songs, they are meeting each other at a park, or they are breaking up and crying in the woods or something. So like, she's setting her stories and characters in nature. It's just sort of part of their lives of these characters. And that's when it occurred to me, there was this study that these psychology researchers had done, and they quantified the use of nature words in song lyrics from 1950 until about 2010, and they found a 60% decline, and it's a pretty just steady
Wow.
decline. So where we used to reference, meadows and flowers and sunsets and all this, that was the kind of common vocabulary. If we wanted to make a reference, we'd use a metaphor to nature, or a song would happen out in nature. That was disappearing. And when I started looking at Taylor Swift, and I actually wrote that, and I said, like, basically Taylor Swift has all these nature themes. And then I was about to send it off, and I thought, whoa, I'm a scientist. Is this true, or did I get tricked by just looking at the videos that play on Spotify? So I said, all right, I'm going to sit down, and I copy pasted 32 songs of lyrics, and I went through and I added them all up, and then
Uh-huh.
as my reference, I went to Spotify. It's the most popular playlist of basically all the top songs, and I took 32 songs and I downloaded those lyrics and I went through every one, and that's how I was able to at least say, yeah, there's some scientific rigor behind this, that she uses nature words 7 times more often than all other pop songs, or at least today's pop songs.
Mhm. What you said, that really got my attention from that, but not only that as a culture we're losing our connection to nature in terms of the words that we use, and that really connects to me because I think of scripture. I think of how much the language for nature is really about stewardship and gratitude and the giftedness of the world that we have, as well as understanding our faith and having a broader language for it. And the less we have, that's one of the places where if we lose that, we lose our a connection to nature as well. But then what you wrote, if we want to change the world and safeguard nature, we first have to see it. In order to change the world, in order to safeguard nature, and as well as safeguard ourselves, we first have to see it. And art and culture can help us to do that. So it helped me to place my walks on my Metro Park walks and my time on the Cuyahoga and the music that I listen to and the songs that I hear in church. All of this really threads together to a story. And how do we listen? And how do we listen to people like the headman in the village on the Mekong, whose story is even a little bit more nuanced than that? It's there's to me there's great giftedness in all this. Um, So I want to close with with a question about how do we, if we do want to change the world, if we do want to improve how how people see nature, see not only the joy that's in it, but also the danger of not managing it properly. Um, what direction do we go in? Do we start from a place of critique and recognize where raise our voices in witness and anger against damage that's being done to the created world, or do we instead put our energy behind the joy of experiencing all this and the joy of taking walks and being on the lakefront, or is it somewhere in between?
Yeah, it probably goes back to this idea of balance and that you referenced earlier. We've been talking about. I think we do need to be clear-eyed about the urgency of some situations, and we need to treat people as adults that they can understand and process information. But if we want to inspire people, I think that if we want to inspire action, I think that joy and vision of optimism is the way to go. There's research that shows that if you just present people with problems without really attention to solutions, it breeds apathy, not response. Even if you're showering them with how urgent and terrible it is, if you don't give them a way forward, um, it leads to apathy. And I've been in preparation for this. I was doing a bit of reading. There's this Anglican a member of the Anglican Church named Martin Palmer who started a group called the Alliance for Religion and Conservation, and he has some beautiful lines about this. He says, if we don't give people a vision of the beauty of life, of why life is worth living, why should they change? And then he goes
Mm,
on to say that
mm.
no one was ever really convinced to change their behavior by a pie chart. We communicate through the language of a beautiful language. He said we should
Right.
only use words that are sufficiently understood and even sufficiently loved that those words have been used in a poem. So I don't know if we have to really just speak in poetry, but I think the idea of telling, um, conveying information through stories, and this is something that the world's religions have always done. They convey complex uh, concepts through stories because stories
Mm,
are how we can
mhm.
most easily relate to things. And so I do think we just have a lot of stories that we need to tell, stories of inspiration, stories of success, and that is, I think, sure, we have to be clear-eyed about our challenges that we face, but we need to inspire through our stories and our vision.
Great. Well, Jeff, I'm so grateful for your time. I'm so grateful for your work. Uh, to be able to connect Cleveland's history to the work that you're seeing and going through, and for that really wonderful and supportive vision, I'm really grateful, and I thank you for your time.
Well, I really enjoyed getting to know you and talking to you. So it's been a great experience. Thank you.
Great. I want to thank all of you for joining me on this Earth Day, on this day that we observe Earth Day. Continue to keep us in your prayers, and I continue to ask you to continue not only to pray and to work for environmental preservation and justice, but also I invite you to continue to delight in the gifts that God gives us, to share in gratitude. I like to share in gratitude by going on hikes and by going on bike rides, and so I invite you to do the same as the weather turns and as it gets more beautiful once again, or differently beautiful. Thank you so much for being with us.